Usually when we think about raw natural power, we picture something totally chaotic.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Like a storm or something.
Exactly. Or we picture a massive, roaring mountain river. It's wild and untamed.
Hmm.
And traditionally, our only thought as a society has been basically, how do we throw a giant concrete dam across that water just to turn on our reading lights?
Right. The traditional view of natural resources is, well, it's entirely about illumination, basic utility. We see a river and we immediately think of a light bulb.
But I want you, the listener, to try and exercise with me here. Imagine if you could look at that exact same roaring river, that cascading waterfall, and instead of just seeing light bulbs, you saw cognition.
Cognition, like
It-
like thinking.
yes. What if you could take a massive humming digital brain, and plug it directly into that waterfall?
Oh, well.
What if that river wasn't just generating electricity, but was actually, thinking?
That is, I mean, it's a really striking image. But it's not just poetry,
Mm-hmm.
right? What you're describing is essentially taking the brute kinetic energy of nature and transmuting it directly into artificial intelligence.
And that vivid, almost science fiction premise is exactly what we're exploring today. We are going on a massive mission in this deep dive.
You really are.
I want to talk directly to you guys listening because today's topic is built around an idea that sounds like it's straight out of a cyberpunk novel. But it is rooted in very real, very present day geopolitics and economics.
Yeah, the timing on this is crucial.
So we are unpacking a really fascinating stack of sources today. We've got blogs, we've got tweets, and a highly detailed, comprehensive business plan.
Which the author refers to as a unicorn-grade blueprint.
Exactly, a unicorn-grade blueprint. These documents were published across April and May of 2026 by an author named Paramendra Kumar Bhagat.
And I have to say, the scope of what Bhagat is proposing in these documents is frankly breathtaking.
It really is.
It demands serious analysis because it challenges basically everything we assume about how developing nations are supposed to grow.
So the core subject of this plan is called Himalayan Compute. It is this audacious proposal to take Nepal, a country that the global community traditionally associates with, well, Everest tourism and beautiful mountains.
Right, and unfortunately exporting its own citizens for manual labor.
Yeah, that's a huge part of it. So the plan is to take Nepal and completely rewire its destiny. The goal is to turn it into the Singapore of AI compute.
Which is quite the title.
And the sheer scale of this idea is what hooked me. The plan is to take Nepal's 50,000 megawatts of untapped, economically viable hydropower and use it as the direct fuel for the explosive, exponential global demand for artificial intelligence.
To really ground this, though, we have to look at exactly why this proposal is surfacing right now in 2026.
Right, why now?
Well, if you follow the tech industry at all, we've sort of hit a wall with AI.
Yeah, I've seen the headlines.
But I want to be clear about what that wall actually is. Because it's not the wall everyone predicted a few years ago.
Yeah.
We aren't running out of silicon chips.
Okay.
We aren't even necessarily running out of training data. What we are running out of is power. And we are running out of physical space to put the machines that actually use that power.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because if you're listening to this on your phone, AI feels completely invisible.
Right. It feels like magic.
It's just a text box or a voice assistant. It feels weightless. So why is there a physical bottleneck?
Because AI is actually a physical industrial revolution disguised as a software product.
Oh, that's a great way to put it.
When you type a prompt into an advanced AI model, the computation required doesn't just happen in the ether. It happens on massive racks of highly specialized, incredibly power-hungry servers, usually GPUs.
Graphics processing units, right?
Exactly. The data centers required to train and run these massive models consume electricity, like steel mills once consumed coal.
Wow.
The global demand for AI data centers is projected to surpass 1,000 terawatt hours by 2030.
1,000 terawatt hours.
Yeah. To put that in perspective, that's roughly the electricity consumption of the entire country of Japan, just for computing.
That is absolutely staggering.
It is. So what Bhagat's business plan does is present a solution that is not just, a standard Silicon Valley tech startup pitch.
Right. You're not building an app in a garage.
No, definitely not.
Yeah.
It is framed as a macroeconomic geopolitical infrastructure play. It is a blueprint designed to take an entire nation and completely bypass traditional industrialization.
Okay, so to understand the Himalayan compute vision, we first really have to understand a fundamental economic flaw in how developing nations have historically handled their natural resources.
Yeah, because this is the exact trap that Nepal is currently stuck in.
And it's a trap that defines a lot of global economics, right?
It really does. The standard model for a developing nation with a natural resource is deeply extractive. You have a raw resource, you dig it up, or in this case, you generate it, and you just ship it out to wealthier nations.
And they are the ones who do the actual value creation.
Precisely.
So let's look at Nepal's current primary asset. Those 50,000 megawatts of economically exploitable hydropower.
Massive amount of energy.
Huge. So historically, the Grand National Plan, the accepted wisdom really, has been to court foreign investment, to build giant dams, generate raw electricity, and export those raw electrons across the border to neighboring countries.
Primarily India via these massive transmission lines.
Right.
Which, I mean, it makes sense if you were thinking like a 20th century utility company. You have power, your neighbor needs power, so you sell it.
Makes logical sense on paper.
Sure. But if you look at where the financial value is actually captured in a modern supply chain, it's a terrible deal for the country generating the power.
And this brings us to one of the most compelling analogies from the source text. Exporting raw electricity is basically like selling apples.
Right, apples.
It's a low-value bulk commodity. If you sell apples, you are completely at the mercy of global commodity pricing weather and basically the singular buyer at the border.
You have very little leverage.
Exactly. But selling AI compute that is powered by that electricity, that is selling applesauce.
Apples versus applesauce.
Ugh.
Love that. But let's break down the actual mechanics of why that distinction is the bedrock of this entire business plan.
Well, applesauce has branding, it has packaging, it has a much longer shelf life.
Yeah.
It commands exponentially higher profit margins, and most importantly, it generates recurring, predictable revenue. You aren't just selling a raw input anymore. You are selling a highly processed, specialized, high-value product.
And if we look at the raw numbers, the multiplier effect here is massive.
Yeah.
As an energy producer selling raw electricity over a cross-border wire, you might make, what, a few cents per kilowatt hour?
Barely anything.
Right. It's a volume game with razor-thin margins. But what happens if you don't export the power? What if you build an advanced data center campus right next to the hydroelectric dam?
So the power literally never leaves the mountain.
Precisely. The cheap, clean electrons travel maybe a few hundred yards into a hyperdense server farm. They power the servers, and what gets exported aren't electrons.
Right, it's data.
What gets exported over fiber optic cables are compute cycles, GPU hours, and AI inference services.
Okay, let me pause you there, because we need to make sure these terms make sense to everyone listening. When you say exporting an inference service, what does that actually mean for the buyer?
That's a good point. In AI, there are generally two main phases, training and inference.
Okay.
Training is when you feed massive amounts of data into a supercomputer for months on end just to teach the AI how to think.
Right, that's the heavy lifting phase.
Exactly. Inference is what happens later, when a user actually asks the AI a question and the model has to infer the answer.
Like when I ask a chatbot to write an email.
Exactly. Yeah. But both of these phases require massive computation. The companies providing these AI services to the world, the big cloud providers, the hyperscalers like AWS, Microsoft, Azure, Google Cloud, they are absolutely desperate for what's called a power purchase agreement, or PPA.
Wait, why? Can't they just plug their data centers into the regular power grid wherever they happen to be?
They could. But grids in the US and Europe are becoming incredibly strained. And more importantly, they are heavily reliant on fossil fuels.
I see.
These hyperscalers have made massive, very public pledges to be carbon neutral. They can't run a multi-billion-dollar AI infrastructure on coal power without facing massive backlash.
Public relations nightmare.
Exactly. They need predictable 100% clean green energy for the next 15 to 25 years. They need a PPA that guarantees the lights won't go out, the price won't randomly spike, and the carbon footprint is zero.
So the pitch is essentially, Nepal stops selling cheap apples to its neighbors and starts selling premium organic applesauce to Microsoft and Google.
That's the dream.
You are transmuting water into intelligence. And intelligence sells for a massive, massive premium. But I have to push back here.
Okay, let's hear it.
Because anyone listening to this who has ever looked at a topographic map of Nepal is going to ask this immediately. We're talking about the Himalayas.
Right.
The tallest, most rugged mountain range on Earth. The author is talking about moving from raw power to highly advanced tech infrastructure. Isn't building physical infrastructure in the Himalayas just incredibly difficult?
Oh, it's brutally difficult.
You have challenging terrain, high altitudes, monsoons, complex logistics. You were talking about hauling thousands of tons of concrete and steel?
Yep.
High voltage transformers, an incredibly fragile multi-million-dollar NVIDIA server racks up treacherous mountain passes.
Sounds impossible.
Right. So how does this actually leapfrog traditional development when the physical barrier to entry is so incredibly punishing?
It's the critical question. The logistics of building the initial infrastructure are undeniably brutal. You cannot sugarcoat the difficulty of hauling heavy industrial equipment into the Himalayas.
So how do they justify it?
The answer to your question reveals the really unique nature of the digital economy and why this leapfrog strategy is even mathematically possible. Let's compare it to traditional industrialization.
Oh.
If Nepal wanted to become the next Shenzhen, like a manufacturing powerhouse making cars or iPhones, what would they need?
Well, they'd need deep water ports, massive shipping fleets, multi-lane cargo highways, rail networks.
Yes, they would have to build incredibly complex physical supply chains. They would have to move millions of tons of steel and plastic and finished goods in and out of the country every single day forever.
Right, which is impossible.
For a landlocked country like Nepal, surrounded by massive neighbors, that geographic reality has always been an insurmountable economic disadvantage.
You can't just put a deep water port in Kathmandu.
Exactly. But compute export is fundamentally different. An AI data center requires massive upfront construction.
Yes.
You have to get the servers up the mountain.
That's a one-time pain, though.
Precisely. Once the initial hardware is installed, the supply chain radically shifts. You aren't shipping physical boxes of AI over mountain passes on diesel trucks.
You are exporting digital cognition at the speed of light over glass threads.
Yes. The friction is entirely front-loaded.
Oh, I see. So the data itself doesn't care that the country is landlocked.
The data doesn't weigh anything. So geography goes from being a historic disadvantage to an absolute advantage.
That is wild to think about.
And this is where the physics of computation heavily favors the Himalayas. Data centers generate an immense amount of heat.
Right, because computers get hot.
Very hot. If you pack tens of thousands of GPUs into a warehouse, it essentially becomes an oven. Cooling those machines usually requires massive amounts of electricity just to run industrial air conditioners.
Which obviously eats into your profit margins and your energy pool.
Right. But if you place these data centers in a naturally cool, high-altitude Himalayan climate, your power usage effectiveness, your PUE, drops significantly.
Okay, let's define PUE for the listener because the business plan leans heavily on this metric.
It's a very important metric in this industry.
What is a good PUE versus a bad one?
So power usage effectiveness is the ratio of the total amount of energy used by a computer data center facility to the energy delivered to the actual computing equipment.
Okay, so the lower the better.
Exactly. A perfect PUE is 1.0. That would mean 100% of the electricity goes into the computer processors and absolutely zero goes to lighting or cooling.
Which is impossible in reality.
Right. The current global average for data centers is around 1.58.
So what does that mean practically?
That means for every single watt of power used to compute, another 0.58 watts is completely wasted on cooling the building.
Just blowing cold air around.
Yeah. The business plan projects that by using ambient mountain air and cold glacial river water for cooling Himalayan compute can achieve an ultra-efficient PUE of 1.2 to 1.3.
Wow, that's a huge drop.
In the world of hyperscale computing, shaving off 0.3 from your PUE across hundreds of megawatts translates to billions of dollars in savings.
And radically higher profit margins.
Exactly. The mountains are literally doing the work that massive air conditioners do in places like Texas or Virginia.
Okay, so if you're following along with us, we've established what the product is. High margin AI compute powered by hydro.
Yeah.
And we've established how the geography goes from a curse to a blessing. But we really need to understand why Nepal is uniquely positioned to sell this to the global market.
Right beyond just having cold air and fast rivers.
Because other places have cold air and water. Look at Iceland. They have cold air. They have geothermal.
True, Iceland has been doing green data centers for years.
So why Nepal?
This is where the specific geopolitics of 2026 come heavily into play. The sources introduce a concept that is absolutely central to the plan: becoming a compute Switzerland.
Compute Switzerland. I mean, it's a great piece of branding.
It's more than branding, really. It's a geopolitical wedge strategy. Look at the map. Nepal is situated directly between the world's two most populous nations, India and China.
Two massive tech giants.
Exactly. In a world where technology infrastructure is increasingly seen as a matter of strict national security neutrality, is a massive monetizable asset.
Because right now, the tech world is basically splitting into massive localized factions.
Exactly. We are seeing the rise of sovereign AI. Nations do not want their government data, their defense algorithms, or their citizens' financial data sitting on servers controlled by foreign adversaries.
Nobody wants their secrets in another country's cloud.
Right. Nepal offers a politically neutral trusted zone. If you are a major U.S.-aligned defense contractor or a massive American tech conglomerate, you are actively avoiding routing your infrastructure through anything that has ties to China.
You want a safe harbor.
You need a safe harbor.
Yeah.
But the business plan doesn't just rely on the U.S., it casts a much wider net.
Yeah, I noticed the author explicitly targets Indian enterprise startups too.
Exactly. These are companies that need massive amounts of compute to scale, but maybe they lack cheap domestic green energy options within India's current grid constraints.
And more intriguingly, the plan aggressively targets Gulf sovereign wealth initiatives.
This is a really crucial pivot. We're talking about initiatives like Saudi Vision 2030 or the UAE's massive AI projects.
Right.
These are nations with practically limitless capital and incredibly aggressive ambitions to dominate the post-oil economy through AI.
But they have a massive problem.
They do. They are located in scorching deserts.
Which is the worst place to build an oven-like data center.
Running massive AI clusters in the Middle East requires astronomical cooling costs. They need trusted, clean infrastructure partners in cooler climates to host their sovereign clouds. Nepal is pitching itself as that neutral green vault.
Okay, so the potential buyer pool is essentially the wealthiest, most power-hungry entities on the planet. U.S. tech giants, Indian enterprises, Gulf state sovereign wealth funds.
It's a huge addressable market.
But here's the reality check. You cannot run a world-class, hyper-advanced technology operation with just cold water electricity and good political positioning.
No, you definitely need more than that.
You need people, highly trained, brilliant people. And this brings us to the human element of this plan, which I frankly found deeply ambitious.
It's the core of the whole thing, really.
For decades, Nepal has suffered from a severe brain drain.
It's been the defining demographic and economic challenge for the country. Millions of citizens, especially the youth and the highly educated, have left for opportunities in the Gulf, in Europe, in the United States or Australia.
It's just a constant outflow of talent. But the sources outline a vision to flip that dynamic entirely. They call it a brain harvest.
A brain harvest. It sounds a bit intense, but the author uses a very specific historical precedent to validate this idea. They draw a direct comparison to Estonia and the creation of Skype.
Yes, the Skype moment. I really want to interrogate this analogy because it's powerful, but it also has limits.
Sure.
The story goes that before Skype, nobody on the global stage thought of Estonia as a tech powerhouse.
Not at all.
But when Skype emerged from Estonia and became a globally dominant communication tool, it shattered a psychological barrier.
It completely changed the narrative.
Right. It proved that world-class tech didn't have to come from Silicon Valley. It created an entire ecosystem of founders, angel investors, and engineers who actually stayed in Estonia and built the next generation of companies.
And Himalayan Compute is explicitly pitched as Nepal's Skype moment.
The idea is to act as a magnet.
Exactly. Nepal has a massive, highly educated diaspora. There are Nepali engineers working at FAAng companies, AI researchers at top universities, startup founders in Silicon Valley.
They are everywhere.
The pitch is to draw that top-tier talent back home, not by appealing to their sense of charity, but because there is finally a project ambitious enough and theoretically funded well enough to offer a Silicon Valley speed culture and compensation package right in the Himalayas.
But I have to push back on the Estonia analogy.
Oh, why is that?
Because Skype was a software application. It was just code. Two guys with laptops and an internet connection can write a VoIP protocol. It's incredibly cheap to prototype and distribute.
That's true.
Himalayan Compute is heavy, multi-billion-dollar infrastructure. You can't build a dam and a data center in a local cafe. So while the psychological impact might be the same, the friction to get there is astronomically higher. Is it really fair to compare the two?
It's a very fair critique. Building physical infrastructure is orders of magnitude harder than writing software. However, the author isn't really comparing the mechanics of the businesses. They're comparing the macroeconomic effect.
That's so.
Right now, Nepal's macroeconomy operates on what the author calls an extractive model. The economy relies heavily on tourism, where a large percentage of profits leak out to foreign tour operators and hotel chains and labor export.
The remittance economy.
Exactly. You send your strongest, smartest, and most capable people away to work in foreign countries, and they wire cash back home.
Right.
It's a survival strategy. It keeps the country afloat, but it is not a growth strategy. It hollows out the nation's potential.
So by keeping the wealth generated inside Nepal and by creating thousands of high-wage specialized jobs.
And we're not just talking about coding here.
Right, we're talking about network engineers, cybersecurity experts, fiber optic layers, high-density cooling technicians, project managers. This project is framed as the ultimate anti-remittance strategy. You aren't exporting your labor to build someone else's country. You are importing foreign capital to build your own.
That is the core socioeconomic promise of the plan. And if they can achieve even a fraction of it, it completely changes the trajectory of millions of lives.
Okay, so we have the location mapped out. We have the core economic rationale of apples versus applesauce. And we have the talent strategy of the brain harvest.
We've covered the foundation.
But the conversation really has to shift now to the sheer breathtaking scale of this ambition. Because as you read through these blogs and this business plan, it becomes rapidly clear that this isn't just a pitch for a nice, successful billion-dollar data center company.
No, definitely not.
It is a roadmap to $1 trillion.
It represents a fundamental shift in categorization.
Yeah.
The author wants to move completely past the language of Silicon Valley.
Right. I mean, we all know what a unicorn is. A privately held startup valued at over $1 billion. It used to be rare, hence the name, though they are way more common now.
Sure.
But the sources introduce a new term, the Solara.
If a unicorn is a billion-dollar company, a Solara is a trillion-dollar company.
The grand Solara vision.
It's quite the phrase.
Here's where it gets really interesting for you listeners, because the author doesn't just throw the word trillion around as a buzzword. There is a meticulously detailed, multi-phase, 10-year execution roadmap.
And we really need to walk through these 5 phases.
Because they escalate in a way that literally forces us to question the limits of infrastructure.
Let's break them down. Phase 1, covering years 0 to 3, is labeled ignition and scale. This is the foundational phase.
So how do they actually start?
It starts with establishing a dual headquarters structure, simultaneously in San Francisco and Kathmandu.
Okay, what's the logic there?
The logic is to bridge Silicon Valley capital network and talent directly with local execution and government relations in Nepal.
You need a foot in the valley to get the buyers and a foot in the mountains to build the product.
Exactly. The immediate existential goal of Phase 1 is securing those critical 15 to 25-year power purchase agreements. Without the PPAs, there's absolutely no business.
They need that guaranteed revenue.
Right. So they plan to start by building a 20 to 50 megawatt pilot campus. Once that proves the model works, proving the PUE is actually 1.2, proving the latency is acceptable, they quickly scale that up to 100 or 200 megawatts of IT load.
And according to the plan, this is where they hit that initial unicorn status, right?
Yes. They target a $2 billion to $8 billion valuation by year 3, heavily leveraging that ultra-efficient natural cooling metric.
Okay, so that's years 0 through 3.
Then we move to Phase 2, which covers years 4 and 5. This is the decacorn phase.
A $10 billion valuation.
Right. Here they start running out of easily accessible local capacity.
Yeah.
So they expand operations into the Indian Himalayas. They start tapping into shared river basins across the border.
Scaling up the hydro footprint.
Exactly. They are looking at deploying 500 megawatts to a full gigawatt of IT load. The financial target here is crossing into $500 million to $1.5 billion in annual recurring revenue.
For ARR.
$500 million to $1.5 billion in recurring revenue in just 5 years. That is blistering speed for a software company, let alone heavy physical infrastructure.
It's incredibly aggressive.
But okay, let's say they hit it. Years 6 and 7. They call this the solar pivot. And this is where the plan really started to blow my mind. Because they completely abandoned the very thing that started the company. They moved beyond hydropower.
They absolutely have to if they want to reach Solara scale. You eventually tap out even massive river systems. Yeah. And building new dams takes decades, not years. If your goal is $1 trillion, you need gigawatts of power.
So what's the pivot?
They pivot into hybrid architectures, specifically hydro-solar. They plan massive multi-gigawatt expansions out of the mountains and into the deserts.
Yeah. The plan explicitly names the deserts of Rajasthan and India, expansions into the Gulf states, and eventually stepping into the Sahara Desert to serve the European and Middle Eastern markets.
They are literally chasing the sun across the globe to power the AI grid.
It's a logical, albeit massively ambitious logistical leap. Solar power is cheap, but it obviously only works when the sun shines.
So you need batteries.
You need massive batteries, or you need to pair it with something like hydro that can act as a natural battery.
Right. So that gets us to year 7.
But years 8 and 9 are where the roadmap truly departs from conventional infrastructure thinking. They call this the blue compute layer.
The blue compute layer. This is the wild pivot to wave energy.
Yes.
The plan proposes building floating offshore data centers anchored in the South China Sea.
It sounds like a movie.
It really does. These platforms would theoretically generate their own power from the kinetic energy of ocean waves, and they would use the infinite surrounding seawater for high-efficiency cooling.
Targeting the highly lucrative latency-sensitive Asia-Pacific markets. Places like Singapore, Tokyo, Seoul, directly from the middle of the ocean.
But let's stop and interrogate this for a second. As a listener, you might be thinking, wait, electronics and saltwater do not mix.
Not historically, no.
If I drop my phone in the ocean, it dies instantly. How does a company realistically build a hyperdense GPU server farm on a floating rig in a region known for literal typhoons?
It's incredibly risky.
What about saltwater corrosion? What about the sheer mechanical difficulty of maintaining wave energy converters in violent seas?
It is an engineering nightmare, which is why it hasn't been successfully scaled yet. The corrosion issue alone requires immense advancements in material science.
Right.
The servers would likely have to be completely sealed in submerged inert fluid pods. As for latency, laying subsea fiber optic cables from a floating moving platform to the mainland is incredibly complex.
So why even propose it?
The author's argument is that by year 8, the company will have the billions in free cash flow required to essentially brute force these engineering problems. They are betting that the land constraints in places like Singapore will make ocean compute a financial necessity, regardless of the engineering difficulty.
Okay, so we're floating in the ocean.
Yes.
But even that isn't the peak of this plan.
No, it gets bigger.
Year 10 is the absolute pinnacle of the Solara vision. They call it orbital AI dominance.
Moving from the bottom of the ocean to low Earth orbit.
Yes. The plan proposes partnering with heavy-lift rocket providers. The text specifically name-drops Starship-class economics to launch satellite compute nodes directly into space.
Just think about the physical environment up there.
It's perfect for it.
You have continuous, unfiltered solar power. There are no clouds. There is no night if you position it correctly. And you have the absolute vacuum of space, which is essentially freezing. It solves the cooling problem entirely.
And they plan to connect these orbiting data centers to each other and to the ground using laser inter-satellite links,
Creating a planetary-scale, energy-unconstrained compute fabric that just hovers above the Earth.
And this launching servers into space is the milestone where they project hitting that $1 trillion valuation based on generating $50 billion plus in annual recurring revenue.
Now I have to step in here.
Please do.
As an analyst, when someone hands you a business plan that starts with a hydroelectric dam in Nepal and ends 10 years later with launching server racks into space to hit $1 trillion, the immediate natural reaction is extreme skepticism.
It sounds unhinged.
It really does.
Because it violates the laws of financial physics. Let's look at the actual physics here. It currently costs roughly $1,500 to $2,000 per kilogram to put something into low Earth orbit on a SpaceX Falcon 9.
Which is pretty cheap historically, but still.
Right. A standard high-density AI server rack can weigh over 1,000 kilograms. You are talking about millions of dollars just in launch costs for a single rack before you even power it on. How does the math on that possibly work?
Currently, it doesn't. The math only works if you assume the promises of next-generation rockets, like SpaceX's Starship, actually materialize and drop the cost to orbit down to $10 or $20 a kilogram. The author's basically skating to where they believe the puck will be in 2036.
But even if we ignore the rockets, what about the valuation? A $1 trillion valuation on $50 billion in revenue.
Actually, the financial mechanics of that specific multiple are surprisingly sound.
Really?
We have to evaluate the math the author provides impartially here. In the massive infrastructure market, a $1 trillion valuation is achievable if, and it's a massive if, you have $50 billion in highly predictable, high-margin annual recurring revenue.
So the stability is the key.
Exactly. Tech infrastructure trades on stability. A 20x revenue multiple on 50 billion ARR gets you to $1 trillion.
So if you can generate the cash, Wall Street will absolutely give you the valuation.
Yes. And what the author correctly identifies as the mechanism to reach that cash is the flywheel effect.
Ah, the flywheel. Let's talk about that.
This flywheel is the engine driving the entire decade-long vision. Let's walk through it. First, you secure a long-term compute contract with an AI hyperscaler. Microsoft agrees to buy $100 million of compute over 10 years.
Okay, so you have a piece of paper that promises future money.
Right. You take that guaranteed future revenue contract to a massive bank, and you use it to secure debt financing.
You borrow against the future.
Exactly. You use that massive pile of debt to build more hydropower dams and more data centers.
Which obviously creates more compute capacity.
Right. That new capacity allows you to sign more and larger compute contracts, which then attracts more foreign direct investment, which builds more power.
It just feeds itself.
Once that infrastructure flywheel starts spinning, the capital accumulation becomes exponential. You aren't paying for the space stations out of pocket. You are paying for them with the guaranteed cash flow of your terrestrial dams.
Okay, the math has a theoretical logic to it. I see that.
On paper, yes.
But let's be real for a second and step out of the spreadsheet. A plan, this massive one, that proposes compressing what usually takes 50 years of national infrastructure development into a 10-year sprint.
It's a lot.
It is inevitably going to hit a wall of bureaucracy, especially in a developing nation. You can't just build gigawatt dams without environmental reviews, land disputes, and massive political friction.
Infrastructure is always political. Always.
And beyond the politics, there's the massive risk of social inequality. If you build a trillion-dollar tech company in a country where poverty is still a major widespread issue, how do you prevent a massive social uprising?
It's a very real concern.
You can't have a gleaming, futuristic AI spaceport surrounded by villages that lack basic sanitation. How does this business plan actually propose to solve the human and political bottlenecks on the ground?
It's a vital question. Grand visions usually die in the execution phase, buried under paperwork and local protests. The business plan attempts to preemptively solve these issues by introducing a deeply integrated socioeconomic architecture. We can call it the 10-10 model.
The 10-10 model. Let's look at the first 10.
Okay.
The government one desk. The plan proposes giving the government of Nepal a flat 10% equity stake in Himalayan Compute.
Which is huge.
Why give away a tenth of a potentially trillion-dollar company to politicians?
Well, in exchange for that 10%, the company demands a very specific operational environment, a one-desk policy situated directly in the Prime Minister's office.
Okay. And the sources specifically mention the political environment under PM Balin Shah.
Yeah.
Right.
Now, as we've noted, we aren't endorsing any specific political figure or taking a side on Nepali domestic politics. But we have to impartially report that the author clearly views this specific leadership shift as a catalyst for a new meritocratic era that makes this plan possible.
The author sees it as a symbol of out-of-the-box thinking that can basically override the old guard.
Exactly. The why behind the 10% equity is all about friction reduction. Traditional developing nation bureaucracy can bleed a fast-moving tech company dry. You have to get permits from the Ministry of Energy, the Ministry of Environment, local municipalities, telecommunications regulators.
It sounds like a nightmare.
It can take years just to get permission to pour concrete.
And the hyperscalers won't wait years. They need the compute yesterday.
Right. But if the central government is a 10% shareholder, suddenly they have a vested, massive financial interest in the company's speed and success.
Ah, so if the company is delayed, the government actually loses money.
Yes. The one desk acts as an ultimate bypass. Instead of 30 separate agencies, the company deals with one desk that has the authority to clear all red tape, instantly allowing the company to move at what the author calls Silicon Valley speed in a Himalayan environment.
It aligns the financial incentives perfectly. Make the government a partner, not a toll booth. But the second 10% is the one that really made me pause, and I think it will make you listening pause too. The plan dictates that another 10% of this entire company belongs to a foundation.
The Poverty Ending Foundation.
Yes. And it has a very specific radical mandate. This isn't about, building a few schools, handing out laptops, or slapping a corporate logo on a local charity drive.
No, the mandate of this foundation is direct, unconditional cash transfers to the poorest 20% of the Nepali population.
Like universal basic income for the poorest tier.
Basically, yes. And it's crucial for us to unpack how the author frames this. This is not presented as corporate philanthropy or altruistic charity. It is framed as a hard-nosed, necessary macroeconomic strategy.
Explain that logic. How does giving away billions of dollars in cash actually help a tech company succeed?
It's designed to prevent what economists call the resource curse or the paradox of plenty. We've seen it globally for a century. A developing country discovers vast oil reserves or rare earth minerals. Massive foreign wealth flows in. But because the industry is highly centralized, the wealth only enriches a tiny elite or foreign corporations.
And the average citizens remain impoverished,
They do. And they just sit there and watch their national resources being extracted.
which inevitably leads to instability.
Exactly. It leads to severe social unrest, corruption, oligarchy, and sometimes even civil war. By taking the immense recurring wealth generated from the hydropowered compute and directly injecting a 10% cut into the bottom 20% of the population, the plan attempts to mathematically eradicate extreme poverty overnight.
You take people out of survival mode.
Yes,
If you are starving, you can't think about the future. If you have a guaranteed income floor, you can send your kids to school, you can start a local business.
precisely. And when you do that on a national scale, consumer demand rises across the entire nation. People buy better foods, better housing, local services. The economy flourishes. Social stability increases dramatically.
And desperation migration drops.
Right. People risking their lives to work dangerous jobs abroad plummets. It fundamentally upgrades the economic floor of the entire country.
I understand the theory, I do, but I have to aggressively question the reality of this.
Go for it.
Is it realistic to think a private, for-profit tech company can essentially act as a shadow welfare state?
It's a huge stretch.
History is literally littered with companies claiming they will uplift a nation only to become corrupt monopolies. Are there massive corruption risks here? Who oversees the foundation? Or, to be entirely cynical, is this just an incredibly savvy marketing pitch?
A marketing pitch.
Yeah, is it just a way to ensure local buy-in so villagers don't protest and block the roads when the company shows up to build massive, noisy data centers near their ancestral rivers?
That is a deeply cynical question, but honestly an absolutely necessary one to ask when dealing with infrastructure at this scale.
Yeah.
The reality of massive nation-altering projects is that they must be intertwined with national stability to survive.
They can't exist in a vacuum.
No, you cannot run a highly sensitive, multi-billion-dollar AI cluster, a facility that requires constant uptime, perfect security, and massive logistics in a region plagued by extreme poverty and social unrest.
Because if the local population hates you, your fiber optic cables mysteriously get cut.
Your power lines get sabotaged.
Yeah.
Security becomes impossible, or so incredibly expensive it ruins the economics. So whether this 10% foundation is driven by pure altruism or driven by cold, calculating pragmatism, the end result in the author's mind is the same.
Which is what?
The company recognizes that its own survival, its ability to scale to $1 trillion, is inextricably linked to the economic uplift of the local population. It's risk mitigation on a macro scale.
If the poorest citizens are receiving monthly dividends from the data center, they will defend the data center.
Exactly.
Wow. Okay, so we have a plan to build the one desk to bypass the bureaucracy. We're going to eventually launch orbital data centers, and we're going to try to end national poverty with a 10% equity foundation.
It's a lot to take in.
But to do literally any of this, to pour the first cubic yard of concrete, you need money.
A lot of money.
And as the author astutely points out, traditional Silicon Valley venture capital just isn't built to fund this kind of project.
Right. You don't build hydroelectric dams and space stations with a $2 million seed round from Y Combinator.
Exactly. The sources actually feature this great, somewhat satirical section titled 100 VCs Who Said No.
I love that section.
It highlights the massive cultural hurdle of funding hard tech. The standard Silicon Valley model is built around lean software startups. You build an app, you test it, you pivot, you scale cheaply. But Himalayan Compute is calling for raising $100 million at a $1 billion valuation right out of the gate.
They literally state they want to be born a unicorn.
If you are listening to this and wondering why venture capitalists won't touch this, you really have to look at the capital stack. Because this is fundamentally an infrastructure play, not a software app.
Right. You cannot build a massive hydroelectric water intake, a high-voltage substation, and a high-density liquid-cooled GPU cluster on a shoestring budget in a garage. The capital stack strategy is fundamentally different from software.
Let's break down that capital stack. What are the actual physical costs we are talking about here? Make the math real for us.
Well, the author provides the math. to build a world-class GPU-optimized data center facility from the ground up, including the power integration and specialized cooling systems and the security. The plan requires roughly $8 million per IT megawatt in capital expenditure, or CapEx.
Okay, so if your phase 1 pilot project is 50 megawatts.
50 times 8. You were looking at $400 million in hard costs just to build the shell and power the initial phase.
Before you even buy the chips.
Before you buy billions of dollars worth of AI chips, and before you flip a single switch to generate revenue.
Okay, that explains the VC hesitation.
Venture capital is generally allergic to that kind of massive upfront physical risk. VC funds want to see user growth before they write big checks.
Yeah.
They don't want to fund concrete pouring.
If I can use an analogy here, it's the difference between buying a house and building a whole neighborhood.
Exactly.
A VC might loan you the money to buy an existing house and renovate the kitchen. That's software. But Himalayan Compute is asking for the money to buy the raw land, lay the sewer lines, pave the roads, build the power grid, and then build the houses. It's a totally different class of investment.
That is a perfect analogy. And because the risk profile is so entirely different, the author executes a brilliant strategic pivot in identifying their target investors.
Who do they target?
They acknowledge the VCs will say no, so they turn away from Sandhill Road and look directly toward sovereign wealth funds, particularly in the UAE and the broader Gulf states. They explicitly mention massive national funds like Mubadala and the Public Investment Fund, or PIF.
And this choice of investor connects so deeply, almost poetically really, to the broader global narrative of the last 50 years.
It really does. Think about the macro picture. The Gulf nations built their staggering wealth over the last half-century based on the extraction of a single natural resource: oil.
Right.
They know better than anyone on Earth the geopolitical value of controlling the underlying energy supply. But they also know that the era of oil is slowly transitioning.
So they're aggressively, almost desperately diversifying their wealth into the technologies of the future, specifically AI and green infrastructure.
They need somewhere to put their trillions of petrodollars that will still be valuable in 50 years.
Exactly. But there's a deeply poignant human connection here too, which the author brings to the forefront. For decades, who physically built the gleaming futuristic cities of the Gulf.
Who poured the concrete for the skyscrapers in Dubai, Abu Dhabi, and Doha.
It was migrant workers. And a huge percentage of them came from Nepal. Nepal has spent decades, often in grueling conditions, physically building the infrastructure of the Gulf.
The remittance economy in action right there.
Right. Now, this pitch is attempting to reverse that historical flow. It is asking Gulf capital, which was built partially on Nepali labor, to come back in and fund the digital infrastructure of Nepal.
It's an incredibly poetic and highly strategic alignment of capital history and future ambition.
It really is. But poetry doesn't raise hundreds of millions of dollars. Math does.
Right.
So let's look at the math. What does this all mean for the investor? When you look at the financials, the sovereign wealth funds, the $8 million a megawatt capex,
Right.
what is the ultimate financial thesis? Why would a fund in Dubai actually write a $100 million check to build a data center in the Himalayas?
The thesis is actually incredibly stable, which is ironic given the sci-fi scope of the later space phases.
Right.
The core thesis is this. If Himalayan Compute can secure those 15 to 25-year power purchase agreements for cheap green hydro, and if they can sign just 1 or 2 anchor contracts with major U.S. hyperscalers or Gulf AI initiatives, the entire game changes fundamentally.
The risk basically disappears.
Exactly. Once you have a legally binding, guaranteed long-term revenue contract from a blue-chip client like Microsoft or the Saudi government, you unlock massive project debt financing from global banks.
You take the contract to the bank and say, Microsoft owes me $1 billion over 10 years. Loan me $400 million now to build the facility.
Yes. And at that point, you don't need to dilute your equity by bringing in more venture capitalists. The company transforms from a highly risky tech startup into a deeply predictable utility-scale infrastructure cash machine. It basically becomes a bond that pays incredibly high yields.
Okay, we have covered an absolutely incredible amount of ground today. Let's try to summarize the stakes of this deep dive.
Good idea.
We started with an image of an untapped, roaring mountain river. We explored the concept of apples versus applesauce, realizing the exponential value of transforming raw electricity into AI compute.
We examined the geopolitical wedge becoming a compute Switzerland, offering a neutral safe harbor for sovereign AI, and the demographic strategy of a brain harvest to reverse decades of labor export.
We followed a roadmap that uses the immense wealth generated from selling high-margin compute to grant 10% equity to the government to completely shatter bureaucratic red tape. We debated the feasibility of a 10% foundation designed to literally end extreme national poverty through direct cash transfers, attempting to avoid the resource curse.
And then the plan pushed the boundary of infrastructure even further, outlining a vision to take that immense capital and build hybrid solar campuses in the desert, engineer wave-powered data centers in the volatile ocean.
And eventually partner with heavy-lift rockets to launch servers into low Earth orbit, utilizing the vacuum of space to create a Solara, a trillion-dollar energy unconstrained enterprise.
It is the ultimate economic leapfrog strategy. It's a blueprint for taking a historically overlooked, landlocked developing nation and turning it into an apex predator in the global AI supply chain.
And bringing it all back to you, the listener. The reason this matters, whether you are a venture capitalist, a software engineer, a policymaker, or just someone fascinated by how the world develops, is that this plan shatters the illusion that AI is just weightless code living in the cloud.
Right.
The AI revolution is a hyper-physical, energy-hungry beast. It requires vast tracts of land, billions of gallons of water, specialized cooling, and massive continuous amounts of electricity.
The cloud is actually incredibly heavy.
Very heavy. It has a massive physical footprint. And because of that physical reality, AI is going to literally redraw the geopolitical map over the next 2 decades. Global power, wealth, and influence will inevitably shift toward whoever controls the clean, abundant electricity required to fuel this new industrial era.
Which raises an important question, something for you to mull over long after this deep dive ends.
Yeah.
We are conditioned to think the future belongs to the places that invented the past.
Yeah.
Silicon Valley, London, Tokyo. But if the true absolute bottleneck of the 21st century is clean energy for computation, what happens to global power dynamics when landlocked, mountainous, historically ignored developing nations suddenly hold the keys to the future of digital cognition? Could the next Silicon Valley actually be a Himalayan valley?
If the river can think, anything is possible. Thank you so much for joining us on this incredibly deep journey today. We'll catch you on the next deep dive.